My sister called me crying. Mom's in the hospital. We need $35,000 for surgery. Can you wire it today? I'd just seen her post photos from Paris, a trip I wasn't invited to. So I said, I'll think about it, and hung up. An hour later, my aunt called. How can you be so heartless? So I sent the entire family her vacation photos and asked why they couldn't pay for it themselves. I, 32M, was sitting in my apartment with a cup of cold coffee when my phone buzzed. My sister's name flashed on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since she made a point of excluding me from her wedding anniversary dinner with the extended family. But something made me pick up, and within seconds, I heard crying. The kind of panicked, desperate crying that cuts through all the nonsense. She told me that Mom had collapsed that morning while at home alone. They'd rushed her to the hospital, and the doctors had diagnosed a condition with her heart that required emergency surgery within a week. The surgical team had quoted $35,000, and insurance would only cover about 40% of it. She was calling everyone systematically, asking if anyone could help wire money today. Her voice was shaking as she explained the situation, and even with our complicated relationship, I felt a sharp jolt of concern. Mom was important to me, regardless of everything else that had happened between us over the years. I told her I'd think about it, and hung up. It wasn't a refusal, it was genuine uncertainty. I had the money, but I wanted time to process what she was asking and why it felt so urgent. That's when I made the mistake that would define the next few hours of my life. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened Instagram. I scrolled through my feed until I found her account, the one she'd been more active on lately. And there it was. Photos from the last 10 days. Paris, the Eiffel Tower, cafes with overpriced wine, shopping on the Champs-Élysées, a sunset on a boat along the Seine with the city glowing behind her. She was smiling in every single one, that particular kind of smile people use when they're documenting a perfect moment for the internet. The captions were explicit. One talked about how she finally deserved a break after years of working hard. Another mentioned that she'd been saving for this specific trip for over a year. A third caption joked about how this was her dream come true, and she didn't care about anything else while she was there. My apartment suddenly felt very quiet. The coffee in my mug had gone cold an hour ago, and I was sitting there staring at my phone screen like it might change if I looked at it long enough. The photos were dated from just 5 days ago. Some of them were from 4 days ago. The surgery was happening next week, meaning she'd probably gotten the news about Mom's condition while already in Paris. And she'd stayed. She'd finished her vacation. She'd kept taking photos and posting them to Instagram. And then, only after she came home, she'd called me in a panic about emergency money. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more calculated. A clarity about what I needed to do. An hour later, my aunt called. She didn't even say hello. She jumped straight into telling me that I was heartless, that blood was thicker than water, that I should be ashamed of myself for not immediately saying yes to helping with Mom's surgery. Her voice was shrill and accusatory, and I could hear my uncle in the background adding his own commentary, reinforcing her points with his own opinions. They'd apparently decided I was the villain in this story before even knowing my actual response. My aunt told me that the family was disappointed and shocked by my selfishness. That's when something snapped inside me. Not in anger, but in cold clarity. I didn't argue with my aunt. I didn't explain myself or defend my position. Instead, I calmly told her I'd be sending her something important for the family to discuss, and hung up. Then I went to work at my computer. I downloaded all of my sister's Paris photos from Instagram, the entire gallery, every single image. Then I created a new email thread with my aunt, my uncle, both my parents, my sister's husband, and 3 cousins I knew would amplify this message through the family grapevine like wildfire. I attached every single vacation photo. The message was simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. I wrote that I was genuinely concerned about Mom's health and that I wanted to help however I could. But I had a series of questions for the family to discuss collectively. If my sister had enough money to spend several $1,000s on a Paris vacation, a trip she'd posted about extensively and described as a dream come true, then why exactly was the family burden for Mom's surgery falling solely on me? I asked if perhaps they could contribute from their savings, or if maybe my sister could use the funds she'd clearly set aside for travel. I wondered aloud if everyone was aware of the timing, that she'd been posting vacation photos while simultaneously calling me with an emergency about money. I did not make accusations. I did not call her a liar. I just presented facts and asked innocent-sounding questions. The response was immediate and nuclear. My phone started buzzing within minutes of that email going out. My mom called first, her voice confused and conflicted. She explained that my sister had indeed mentioned a vacation, but Mom had assumed it was planned long ago, before the health issues emerged. The surgery diagnosis had apparently been recent, just discovered during a routine checkup. My mom was trying to defend my sister's actions, but there was a thread of doubt in her voice now that hadn't been there before. She admitted that my sister had already transferred $5,000 to the hospital as a down payment from her savings, which at least showed some effort. But she also wanted to know why my sister hadn't mentioned the timing to anyone. My aunt called back within 20 minutes, furious and breathless. She accused me of betraying the family, of trying to make my sister look bad, of creating unnecessary drama during a medical crisis. But I noticed she didn't directly address the questions I'd asked in my email. She just kept circling back to how I was making everything worse and being manipulative. My sister's husband called next, his voice tight with controlled anger. He said that my sister had been crying for the past hour after seeing my email sent to the entire family. He called me a selfish asshole who couldn't see beyond his own resentment and personal issues with his sister. He claimed that my sister had worked hard and deserved her vacation, and that it wasn't her fault the surgery came up afterward. He said if I couldn't help without being cruel about it, then they didn't want my help at all. He told me I was toxic to the family. I listened to all of this without responding emotionally. I let him say everything he needed to say, and then I simply hung up. Instead of arguing further, I made a decision that I knew would either destroy or rebuild my relationship with my sister permanently. I called her directly. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear her sniffling, trying to compose herself. She was angry, but mostly just sounded scared and exhausted by the entire situation. I didn't start with blame. Instead, I told her something that cut through all the noise. I told her that regardless of everything else, regardless of the vacation, the timing, the way she'd handled this entire situation, Mom needed help and I would contribute. I would wire $15,000 to the hospital tomorrow morning. No strings attached on that part of the deal. But then I told her what I actually needed from her. I explained that I needed her to be honest with the family about the timeline, about planning the vacation, about the surgery being a recent discovery, and about how she'd actually approached asking for money. I told her that right now, everyone was either defending her or defending me, and nobody actually knew the truth. I said that by being the only one telling the truth in this situation, she could actually earn back the family's respect instead of just getting their pity or guilt. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her breathing, thinking, processing what I was asking. She told me she couldn't do that. She said the family would judge her too harshly if they knew the full context. She explained that people wouldn't understand why she'd gone to Paris when she'd known there were medical issues brewing. She said it was complicated, and she'd been stressed and unhappy, and the vacation had been her escape from reality. The surgery had come as a shock, even though part of her had been expecting something was wrong. She'd panicked when the diagnosis came through, and she'd assumed everyone would help because that's what families did, regardless of her recent decisions. I told her that was exactly the problem. I explained that I was willing to help Mom because Mom was innocent in all of this. But my sister needed to take responsibility for her own choices instead of expecting everyone else to absorb the consequences and the criticism. I told her that by lying through omission to the family about the timing, she was making me look like the villain in a situation she'd created through poor planning, poor judgment, and poor character. She told me I was being cruel and unsympathetic. I told her I was being honest, and maybe our family needed more honesty and less enabling of bad behavior. I told her that this was me actually trying to help her, even though it didn't feel like help in the moment. I wired the $15,000 the next morning. I sent it directly to the hospital with a note explaining that it was specifically for Mom's surgery and that it should be applied to the account. I didn't tell anyone else about the transfer. I just let it happen quietly and waited to see what would unfold. What followed was 3 days of absolute chaos that I watched unfold through messages, calls, and family group chat explosions. My aunt somehow found out about my contribution and called to apologize, but also to express frustration that my sister was now being more honest with the family about her vacation timing. Apparently, after thinking about what I'd said on the phone, My sister had finally confessed to the family that the trip had been planned for months, that she'd known she wanted to go, and that she'd gone anyway even though she'd been experiencing symptoms and suspected something might be medically wrong. The family split into distinct camps almost immediately. Some people felt genuinely betrayed by my sister's dishonesty and her lack of foresight. Others thought I'd been too harsh in my approach and that my public call-out had been unnecessarily cruel. My mom expressed gratitude for my financial help, but also disappointment in how I'd chosen to handle the information about the vacation and her daughter's decision-making process. My uncle called to say that my sister was heartbroken over the entire situation and that my approach had damaged their relationship irreparably. He said I could have helped quietly without making a statement or forcing the issue. I didn't respond the way he wanted. I just listened and let him say his piece before ending the conversation. Here's what happened next that made this entire situation worth documenting and understanding. 2 weeks after Mom's surgery, which went well and left her in good health, my sister reached out. She didn't apologize in any direct sense, but she acknowledged that I'd been right about how she'd handled the situation. She said that by being called out publicly in front of the entire family, by having the facts of her vacation presented so clearly, she'd been forced to confront her own choices in a way she wouldn't have otherwise. She admitted that she'd been irresponsible with her money planning, that she'd acted entitled by assuming I'd bail her out without question, and that she'd tried to manipulate the family narrative by not being upfront about the timing. She asked if we could talk about rebuilding our relationship, and this time there was genuine humility in her voice. I told her that I was willing, but that it had to be built on actual honesty. I explained that my anger wasn't about the vacation itself or her spending money on something she wanted. My anger was about being expected to drop $35,000 on immediate demand while she'd been living it up in Paris taking photos for Instagram, and then being painted as the villain when I simply asked basic questions about how she was managing her finances. She said she understood that now, and it had taken seeing the vacation photos sent to the entire family for her to really grasp how it looked from outside her own perspective. What's genuinely ironic is that my approach, which the family initially condemned as cruel and unnecessarily harsh, actually forced my sister to become a better person. She started being more careful with money and more thoughtful about her spending. She had actual conversations with her family instead of just asking for things and assuming they'd materialize. She became more transparent about her life and her decisions instead of managing everyone's perception of her. My parents' relationship with her also improved noticeably because it was now based on honesty instead of her constantly trying to manage their perception of her. The satisfaction I felt wasn't from being proven right or from watching my sister face consequences. It was from seeing that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for someone is force them to confront their own behavior instead of enabling them to continue living in convenient denial. The vacation photos that I'd sent to the family ended up being the catalyst for real, lasting change. Not because I'd meant them as a punishment or an attack, but because they'd forced everyone to see the situation clearly instead of accepting the edited version my sister was presenting. Mom's surgery recovery went smoothly and exceeded expectations. She was back home within 3 weeks, and her health has been stable since the operation. She actually thanked me separately from my sister, acknowledging that while my method had been harsh and uncomfortable, my willingness to help was what actually mattered most in the end. I never brought up the situation again after that. I just moved forward quietly, with a family that was now operating with a little more honesty and accountability than it had been before. Update 1. About a month after the initial situation resolved, my sister reached out again. This time, she wasn't asking for anything from me. She wanted to take me to dinner to apologize properly and meaningfully. I agreed, curious to see where this conversation would go and what she'd actually figured out during the previous month. During dinner, she explained that after I'd forced the family to confront the vacation timing, she'd experienced something like an awakening. She realized that she'd spent years operating under the assumption that family would always bail her out, that her problems were everyone's responsibility. She said that seeing her vacation photos sent to the entire family, knowing that everyone now understood exactly what she'd been doing while asking for emergency money, had been mortifying in a way that no argument or lecture could ever achieve. She told me that she'd actually gone back through her finances carefully and realized how much money she'd wasted on things she didn't even remember enjoying. The Paris trip was beautiful, and she didn't regret taking it exactly, but she regretted the financial irresponsibility and the lies of omission. She'd also apparently had a long conversation with her husband about their finances and their approach to money, and they'd decided to be much more intentional and transparent going forward. What surprised me most was that she'd already started paying me back. Not because I'd asked her to or pressured her, but because she felt like she owed it to me for standing up to her when the rest of the family was willing to let the situation slide into comfortable ambiguity. She'd already deposited $3,000 into my account without telling me first, and she planned to send more over the next few months until she'd repaid the entire $15,000. I told her that wasn't necessary, that I'd given the money to help Mom and her, but she insisted firmly. She said it wasn't really about the money. It was about her taking responsibility for her own life instead of expecting everyone else to handle the fallout from her poor decisions. We actually became closer after that dinner. It turns out that by being willing to let her face consequences instead of just enabling her behavior, I'd actually done something that helped our relationship long-term. She respected me more for standing my ground, and I respected her for being willing to genuinely learn from the situation instead of just apologizing to make peace. The family dynamics shifted too. Other family members started calling me to acknowledge that while they'd initially thought my approach was harsh, they could see now that it had actually been necessary. My aunt even apologized for the things she'd said, admitting that she'd been enabling my sister's behavior without even realizing it. She told me she'd been reflecting on how many times she'd enabled poor decisions in the family without addressing them directly. Update 2. 3 months after the initial situation, my sister and her husband had fully transformed their approach to finances and family communication. They'd enrolled in a financial planning course together through their bank, and they'd started having actual conversations about money and future planning instead of just spending impulsively and hoping it would work out. My sister got a promotion at work around the same time, which she credited partly to the confidence boost she felt from taking control of her life instead of just drifting through it. More importantly, she'd stopped trying to manage the family's perception of her. She was honest about her struggles, her failures, and her progress. This honesty made her more relatable and actually improved her relationships across the board with everyone. She'd also finished paying me back completely. When she handed me the final payment, she told me something that made the entire ordeal feel genuinely worthwhile. She said that what I'd done, forcing her to confront her own behavior publicly, had actually prevented her from making even worse financial decisions down the road. She'd been on the verge of signing up for an even more expensive vacation with some friends, and the wake-up call about the Paris trip had stopped her from repeating the same destructive pattern. Mom's health continued to improve steadily. She was back to her normal activities, gardening and visiting friends, and she made a point of thanking me again when I visited. She also mentioned that she'd noticed the positive changes in my sister and that she was grateful that I'd been willing to be the temporary bad guy in order to create lasting family change. The interesting thing about this entire saga is that it reinforced something I'd already suspected, that families often enable destructive behavior because it's easier than having difficult conversations. By being willing to be unpopular, by being willing to send those vacation photos to the entire family, I'd actually done everyone a favor. It forced conversations that needed to happen and created accountability where there had been none before. Update 3. 6 months after the initial situation, the family had settled into a new normal that was markedly healthier than before. My sister had become one of the most financially responsible people in our entire family, ironically. She'd even started giving other family members advice about budgeting and planning, drawing from her own hard-earned lessons and mistakes. My relationship with her had evolved into something more genuine and real. We actually spent time together by choice now, not just out of obligation at family events. When we talked, the conversation felt authentic instead of performative. She wasn't trying to impress me or manipulate my perception of her anymore. She was just being herself, flaws and all. The Paris vacation photos that I'd sent to the family had become something of a dark joke that the family would laugh about. Whenever anyone in the family made an impulsive decision without thinking about the consequences, someone would jokingly reference the Paris photos and ask if this was going to require another intervention. Instead of being a permanent source of shame, they'd become a teaching moment that everyone could laugh about and learn from. What struck me most looking back was that my willingness to be the villain in my sister's narrative had actually made me the hero in the larger family story. By refusing to enable her behavior, by forcing accountability where there had been none, I'd set off a chain reaction of positive change that rippled through the entire family structure. Mom's surgery had been completely successful, and she'd actually recovered better than the doctors had predicted. The $15,000 had been well spent, and I had no regrets about contributing or about how I'd chosen to handle my sister's dishonesty and entitlement. What I didn't regret either was my method of addressing the situation. It had worked, perhaps better than any gentle conversation or quiet judgment could have. The lesson that emerged from all of this was simple but profound. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. Sometimes being honest and direct, even when it's uncomfortable and unpopular, is what a person actually needs in order to grow and change. My sister had needed to be called out, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of tough love. And in the end, she'd recognize that and thank me for it, genuinely. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too.